You know the landlord rang my front door bell. I let it ring for a long, long spell. I went to the window and peeked through the blind and asked him to tell me what was on his mind. He said, money, honey, yes, money, honey, yes, money, honey, if you want to stay here with me.
And that was Money Honey by Ella Mae Morse, and this is Marie McCary bringing you the latest edition of Why Don't Economists here on BCB 106.6 FM, a programme about alternative ideas in economics. Well, there's been a lot of talk recently about free trade, but like all things, free trade is only good up to a point. There is a lot to be said for maximising self-sufficiency. But there is a lot of talk of war propaganda in the media with constant denigration of Russia, China and Japan. And this is very worrying. But why would the establishment want to push us into war? To understand that, you need to understand how banks create money out of thin air when they give out loans. And this is all well detailed in the videos and website of positivemoney.org. And we also need to understand about how the dollar is losing its status as the reserve currency. It was decided that the dollar would be the reserve currency after the war, but that was under the condition that printing it was limited to how much gold was in the US reserves. But this limitation was stopped in 1971, and instead the US came to an agreement with the oil-producing countries to only accept payment for oil in dollars, and in return they would protect them. So the dollar remained the reserve currency as countries needed dollars to buy oil, but oil was too cheap to allow lots of dollars to be printed, so the oil crisis was engineered to make oil more expensive, thereby allowing massive US trade deficits to be financed by dollar printing. This was brilliant for the US economy. It had no need for a balance in trade. It could live off the sweat of other countries. One must remember that the Federal Reserve Bank is privately owned by a consortium of international banks. So the benefit of all this dollar printing was going to private banking interests. And this ability to print money also meant that the US could afford to build up a massive military to deter any country from upsetting this very beneficial system. Unfortunately for Iraq, Saddam started selling oil in euros. So the US had to invent the weapons of mass destruction lie in order to show the oil-producing countries what happens to recalcitrants. Libya had also been developing a gold-backed dinar and had been selling oil in currencies other than the dollar, so Libya had to be dealt with. And recently Iran has stopped trading its oil for dollars. Syria is an ally of Iran, and it rejected an oil pipeline to Europe from Qatar, a very obedient oil-producing country, and approved one from Iran instead. So Syria had to be dealt with. Putin and Russia understand this whole system of dollar domination completely and have been signing massive trade agreements using currencies other than the dollar. So even despite these wars, the status of the dollar as a reserve currency is diminishing. This dampens the demand for the dollar, which means that less can be printed. This also means that in the upcoming financial crash, it will be difficult to save the banks by printing money. War is the only answer. Banks make massive profits from wars. Peaceful, prosperous countries don't need to borrow, which affects the bank's ability to print money. Once there is a war, the governments will borrow heavily for munitions and again heavily to rebuild. History shows that the big banks lend to both sides as war is just so profitable for them. As the book by General Smedley Butler said, that was printed early in the 20th century, war is a racket. And this book is free on the internet and is well worth a read. So I've been very disturbed by this constant denigration of Russia, Iran and China in the media. And we have to remember also that the former editor of a leading German newspaper, as he found himself close to death, wrote a book detailing how the journalists and newspapers of the West do as the CIA tells them. And many articles are pushing CIA war propaganda. even under the byline of prominent journalists. The journalist's name is Udo Ulfkotte, and his book will be published in English in the summer, and it was an absolute bestseller in Germany. At least Trump has put a stop to the Trans-Pacific Treaty and to the TTIP, two trade treaties designed to embed the power of the multinational companies over the power of national governments, with secret corporate courts deciding on what regulations regarding food or health, for example, which could be deemed to be barriers to trade. The fact that negotiations for this were being held by the EU in secret tells you all you want to know about in whose interests the EU works, and it's certainly not in the interests of the 99%. The way they protected the interests of the big banks over the people, especially in Greece, tells you everything you need to know. Like the political parties, the EU has been taken over by people only working in the interests of multinational corporations. We are continually told that free trade is always good, but like most things, it is good up to a point, and too much can be bad for us. Too much free trade and the tax-dodging multinationals find it more profitable to produce goods in countries with cheap labour and lax environmental regulations. How is that a good thing for the 99%? Instead of looking at policies under the old right-left dichotomy, it is much more instructive to think, does a policy benefit the 99% or the 1%? And we have to remember that most politicians, both left and right, are not working for the benefit of the 99%. If you understand more about money, it's obvious that the euro is an experiment that has totally failed, and the sooner it breaks up, the better. The coming financial crash will be much easier to overcome if different national governments take the interests of the people first and break up the big banks into such things as local public banks, co-op banks and mutual banks. These have proved very successful in driving the German economy. Banking services are indeed a very important utility, and there should be a diversity of models, and private banks should be a minority and severely regulated and let go if they fail. As I said, the US dollar is losing its reserve currency status, which means that the financial power of the US is diminishing. Its ability to print itself out of trouble is disappearing. Its banks and financial institutions are going to suffer, as is the US economy, which suffers from a massive trade deficit. This will be unsustainable without its ability to print the reserve currency. The US elite need a war. This will give the dollar some more time as the reserve currency, and it will create massive profits. It's a win-win situation for the financial elite. They don't suffer from wars on the Eurasian continent. They prosper, and they have been shown time and time again not to have any care for ordinary people. Be aware of this as you experience the news, especially as they denigrate Iran, Russia or China. We don't need to go to war with any of these countries. There are many alternatives to banks when it comes to investments the community sorely needs and which the big banks ignore. And these are crowdfunding, community shares, etc. And this all comes under the heading of alternative finance. And recently I interviewed Mark Davis, the Associate Professor of Sociology at Leeds University, who has recently published a paper in this field. I started by asking him my normal question: how would you finish the statement, why don't economists? So how would you answer that?
Very simply, why don't economists understand alternative finance would be the start of it. And I think there's a whole series of questions that come out of that around the connection of money to local place. Particularly what I'm interested in is the connection between money and morality. And how the current financial system disconnects those two. Exactly that, yeah.
Before we go any further, how would you define alternative finance?
That's a really good question. It's a set of financial vehicles, financial models for diverting money away from the mainstream financial system.
Which is completely corrupt.
Well, the idea of being alternative to that financial system is really important. You know, there's a whole suite of things that are now available for people to access in terms of using their money differently, away from high street banks, away from ISAs, which, let's be honest, are giving us absolutely nothing in terms of financial return at the moment.
And the beauty of it is that you can direct your money to help the local economy, which the mainstream financial sector gives you no opportunity to do, really, does it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key messages of our report really is how alternative finance, which just to be clear, is we're looking at kind of things like crowdfunding, community share schemes, peer-to-peer loans to individuals or to businesses, but particularly kind of local SMEs, is how alternative finance provides you with an opportunity to invest in particularly local economies, but then the real economy within those local places as well. So tangible businesses, actual material infrastructure. So a lot of alternative finance has looked at green energy, renewable energy projects within local areas, so that not only are local people getting an equivalent financial return by diverting their money into different investment vehicles, but they're also creating something of tangible value to that local community more generally, whether that's socially or environmentally.
Is there a way, rather than having to choose a particular business to invest in, are there funds that invest in local businesses in general that you could just have a part of, but you're invested in, say, 100 different local businesses?
There are some, but it tends to be a case of investing in a particular type of project. So if you look at crowdfunding, which is often the form of alternative finance that people are most familiar with through things like Kickstarter or investing in films and music albums, then crowdfunding tends to be for a particular project. So it might be to rejuvenate a local park, or take some disused land and maybe make it into a play space for children, or make it into a community allotment, let's say, so that you're actually benefiting a particular kind of area, and that's how people tend to feel more inclined to become involved in...
Well, of course, regular listeners will know that I'm a very keen proponent of local public banking, which you could put your money into your local public bank and know that is investing in the local businesses. The profits are going back into the local community as well, and it's 40% of the banking sector in Germany, and that's why Germany is successful. But anyway,
I had a feeling that might be behind your question.
Yeah.
And I think, the Sparkasse model has been very successful in Germany, and I think the UK would be well advised to explore the public banking system or public banking infrastructure as part of this broader alternative finance movement, which is what we've
the banking
looked at
sector
in
England, the City of London is so powerful amongst the political elite, let's say. Maybe not John McDonnell, though, I don't know.
Well, I think that London-centric bias of the UK economy, I think is right. And at the moment, alternative finance as well as a sector is also very much based in London and the South East.
Really?
And yet there's an awful lot of really exciting projects that need to be funded and a lot of money available outside of London. What could we be doing to try and divert that money into things that benefit our community?
It's the North that needs money sourced locally. It's such a fight to get money out of London, that seems to get all the infrastructure spending, etc.
Yeah. One area of the report that is particularly interesting to us, and one of the kind of key findings, I suppose, is that across the 12 months that we ran the project, we started out going to alternative finance events that were run by the kind of suite of civil society organisations that, if you like, kind of provide the moral check on the business side of alternative finance. And they were very active in leading the kind of campaign, if you like, the public campaign for alternative finance and how it can offer this alternative to mainstream banking. But by the end of the project, we were going to events that had been run by some of the major high street banks, so HSBC and Barclays, being very interested in what was happening with alternative finance. This has emerged within the UK and actually globally as the FinTech sector. So FinTech stands for financial technology, and is kind of the same principles as alternative finance, but using these different investment models for private ends rather than public ends.
But they're still not diverting money locally or to your particular sector that you might be interested in, are they?
FinTech, not at all, no, or very rarely. Very rarely. They've launched a standards of FinTech kind of report for what FinTech should be aspiring to do, but it lacks quite markedly that more public-facing moral mission around trying to improve the real economy for local communities.
So still no morality in the financial sector. What a surprise.
Well, I think alternative finance has the chance to re-inject some of that. I think,
oh yeah, the civil not the bank run.
No. I think alternative finance does have the potential to do that, but the caveat at the minute, and this is kind of where our report sort of finishes, is that the movement faces a bit of a crossroads, really. For very sound financial reasons, some of the companies are having to take more institutional money from high street banks, from pension fund investors, from business angels in order to try and grow the sector. But there's a compromise then on the more moral public mission of trying to support local communities, trying to support green energy, trying to support local SMEs. I mean, I think you know your show's pointed out before that only 2 to 3% of bank investment goes into SMEs, and that's staggering.
SMEs provide the most employment, the most innovation, and the most growth.
Yeah.
Than any other sector to invest in, because the multinationals go abroad, obviously. And if you're investing in fixed assets, you're just creating inflation in those fixed assets. But the thing is that the shareholders of these multinationals and the shareholders of these banks are often pension funds, which is us. And we would quite like these companies, these banks, to do these things.
I think there's a really interesting point at the heart of that, which is, I kind of phrase it as a simple question to anyone listening, really, which is, where is your money now? What is it doing? You might think, well, it's in my savings account, or it's in an easy access ISA. All you're getting there really is the kind of the shop front of where your money is. What's it actually invested in? What change is it making happen by being located in that particular ISA or that particular savings account? And I think the answer that people tend to give is, well, I don't really know where my money is or what it's doing. So if you don't know where your money is there a place where you could know where it is and know what it was doing? Because the power for social change very often is in us thinking differently about where our money is and what it might be doing for us individually and for our families, but also for our local communities.
So that's where alternative finance comes in, the community shares, crowdfunding. You know that your money is doing something good, but it is riskier, isn't it, really?
There's obviously a risk attached to it, and I'm certainly not here to speak as an advocate for the sector. We've provided this kind of independent study from outside of the movement precisely because we think it needed that more critical, independent lens on what was happening. So that's really important to us. But it is the case that people are not getting a very good financial return or very good social and environmental benefits from the way in which their money is presently being channeled, the way in which we're currently using our money. And when it comes to it being risky, then of course there's a risk in anything that's alternative or anything that's new. But it's interesting that we continue to think of banks as more trustworthy, bearing in mind what's happened during the financial crisis, bearing in mind how much they operate within their own self-interest very often, and provide us with such poor service, provide us with such a lack of transparency on where our money is and what it's doing. That alternative finance, I think, is at least worth exploring. What's going on within your local community at the moment? What projects are looking for money that actually you think should be supported? People should be doing more around.
Well, you have the option of helping that entity by telling your friends, by using that service. People are getting work from this enterprise. So you have some effect on it. You can help it to become more successful even, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot to be gained from trying, but the ability to try to retain a lot of local capital within the local kind of network of money flow, so that it's actually going to support material, beneficial businesses or projects within a local area.
A percentage of your savings, since there aren't local banks that would enable you to invest in many different local enterprises. You have to do it. Set this money aside. You'll put 5% here, 5% there, 10% there, whatever, as you see fit. and then you have a spread.
And I think that might be one of the ways in which you can start to build some momentum around the public banking argument.
So if there is a risk, one might fail, but something else will take off.
Yeah, in exactly the same way that any investment in a particular kind of, you get low, medium or high risk investments in the mainstream financial system.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about alternative finance, particularly the kind of peer-to-peer market, which is really kind of taken off in the last sort of 2 years, is that it's often kind of seen as being more resilient to market pressures than mainstream financial institutions. So, for example, Zopa, which is one of the first peer-to-peer companies within the UK, gave a consistent rate of return of sort of between 5 and 7%.
Oh, that's very interesting, you see. That's so much better than what you're getting.
Well, yeah, and I think because, you see, the thing is, if you think of a particular product that you buy on a weekly basis, a particular type of coffee or a particular type of food, if the quality of that went down consistently over time so that you were getting less and less and less for your money, you'd stop buying it. You'd look somewhere else. And I think the same argument can be applied to the financial system. If we're getting such a terrible service, not always in terms of customer service, but sometimes, but more in terms of how hard our money is working for us, it's actually not generating any value. It's generating no value for us. It's generating very little value for our community. The only people who seem to be benefiting are those who are in charge of that financial system, who have got very complicated financial vehicles for allowing the generation of profit and the creation of money because of our willingness to become simply more indebted.
So this alternative finance, how can we get to change the mainstream financial system that's not working in our interests? You have no control over where your pension funds are going.
Well, one of the great things about alternative finance, kind of looking at it from the outside, is that you very quickly see that it's much more than just an emerging kind of business sector. Obviously, the companies that have emerged in that space are really important, but alongside that, since the financial crisis in 2007-8, you've also got the emergence of a really active, dynamic and imaginative civil society movement. So organisations like Positive Money, which obviously you're very involved with locally, Finance Innovation Lab, the New Economics Foundation, Move Your Money, Share Action. There's a whole group of organisations.
Yeah, all those websites and organisations are very worth looking at and following.
There are kind of some classic models of how you get political change. The traditional one is obviously through the ballot box, and people can start to think about how different political parties might or might not represent their kind of interests and present a vision of the type of society that we want to live in.
But what can we do to help the alternative finance sector?
Well, a big part of that, I think, is embracing kind of alternative narratives of economic life, really. I think that there's obviously plenty of evidence out there for why the financial system as it stands at the moment doesn't work in the interest of local people. And I think what's interesting for me as an academic kind of is to look at how those alternative narratives, those alternative arguments, they exist, they're very persuasive, they're very powerful in particular areas, and yet the system itself continues in more or less the same way that it always has done.
Yeah, even after the crash, which proved that it doesn't work under its own paradigm of, we can do it, we don't want any interference for the government, let's privatise everything. Pursuit of profit will always make for the most efficiency. And it just collapsed. Mm-hmm. And a
perfectly sensible reaction to that is to say, well, we can spot all the problems with it. Okay, we're persuaded by the narrative. We've checked out these different arguments, but what's the alternative? I'm increasingly persuaded by the idea that the way in which you get tangible social change is to do different things with your money, because at the end of the day, that's what most people care about.
I like this idea of taking the bigger picture with what you do with your money. If you invest it locally in community shares, peer-to-peer, crowdfunding, the banks are going to have to take notice. You're showing the demand to be able to invest your money locally in local small and medium enterprises. And something is bound to happen. It's coming from the bottom up. Mm-hmm. People want to do this. Why isn't there a medium of doing it within the mainstream? But we have to make sure they don't just overtake it and not actually do it properly.
That's the kind of challenge. So firstly, there's got to be enough of a momentum for people to want to look for alternative ways of moving their money and investing their money in things that they believe in more and that are more transparent. And at the more radical kind of progressive end of alternative finance, becoming involved in how companies are run, changing governance models, making sure that people don't just have a financial involvement in a particular project, but can become more active as a volunteer. Or I think we've allowed ourselves over a number of decades, very slowly, to become persuaded by the idea that the economy and finance is somehow separate from society, that we're not qualified enough to understand the economy and understand finance. Somehow we're not allowed to have
deliberately made complicated, I think,
on that. And because of that, because we sort of entertain this idea of it being separate from society rather than fundamentally embedded in everyday life, then we become more persuaded that it should be technical experts and mainstream economists that know how it works. It's very similar to how religion used to work. You used to have priests, local priests would lecture in Latin, in a whole language that the local people didn't speak. And economics has become very similar.
Has developed its own language.
This kind of complex, algorithmical way of explaining finance to people, so that it reinforces that barrier that says, well, I don't know anything about economics, so they must be, not only they must know what they're on about, but they can't be controlled. They're kind of beyond society. They're beyond democratic oversight, and I think that's fundamentally wrong. That should be exactly where we're targeting. I mean, it's important to remember that there are a lot of really good economists out there who are kind of Trojan horse figures who are fighting from within. There's a whole school of heterodox economists who are doing some great, particularly at Leeds.
I try to interview them.
They're particularly at Leeds. There's a really strong heterodox economics department that's linked into the Rethinking Economics student movement, and they're doing some fantastic work there. But you're right, kind of broadly speaking, economics departments are dominated by this kind of neoclassical model that says... But
the politicians are still listening to the mainstream economists, unfortunately, and the media is still writing in the mainstream economist paradigm. That's the problem.
Yeah, and I think they're able to do that more easily because there is a lack of democratic oversight and democratic control. As I say, we tend to just absolve ourselves of responsibility or faith, really, that we understand just as well and often better than they do how money works in our everyday lives. Well, you've got a lot of faith in the German kind of model, and you see that's an alternative.
Yeah, exactly.
That's an alternative way of organising money.
Yeah.
And that gets to the heart of this response to this question of, well, what else can we do?
Yeah.
There are other models out there at the national level in terms of the way that the German public banking system works, but also at the local level in terms of these alternative finance as well. And I think that the capacity of local communities across the UK to be able to think differently about their money and to prioritise local projects as opposed to a national banking system that doesn't work in their interests is a really important first step to opening up this much broader debate about public banking institutions or the way in which money is created, so that it's working in the public interest. And I think it comes back to this kind of basic principle that since the financial crisis, we're being asked to remould whole areas of society to meet the needs of an economy. Things are always justified in economic terms, and I'm arguing that we should remould the economy to meet the needs of societies.
It's like you say about religion. The economic system is man-made. We can change it. So that was great learning about alternative finance, and I did introduce Mark Davies to Lee Craven, who's in charge of the development of the Odeon, as I think that the ballroom within the Odeon, which is hardly damaged and still has its sprung dance floor, could be renovated purely by the community, by alternative finance. So we'll see how that goes. But in the meantime, I'll be back in another 4 weeks with another show of Why Don't Economists? And I leave you again with LMA Morse and Money Honey.
You know the landlord rang my front door bell. I let it ring for a long, long spell. I went to the window and peeked through the blind and asked him to tell me what was on his mind. He said, money, honey, yes. Money, honey, yes. Money, honey. stay here with me. I was clean as a screen and so hard pressed. I called the man that I love best. I finally got my baby about 3:30. He said, I'd like to know what you want with me. I said, money, honey, what? Yeah,